Okay, so now that we have the project set up, what we want to do is fetch this API data from the Star Wars API, but initially we need to set up GraphQL. Essentially what GraphQL is a query language for your APIs where you can select the specific data that you require and not fetch all of the data at once, just like you do in REST. It's an alternative method. So what I want to do is go into my app, and in my terminal, I need to install a few things. So if I close everything off here and look in my package.json, we have testing libraries set up in here, and we also have Jest as well. What I want to do is install something called Apollo Client and GraphQL. I'll leave the links for the documentation in the code, but essentially all I want to do is just do npm I apt apollo/client. That is the first package, and then the space, and then we just want to install GraphQL also. So if you press enter and let that run in our terminal, and we can close the package.json down whilst that is installing on our application. And if we reopen it now, we now see GraphQL here, and we also see Apollo Client here. You can also put these as dev dependencies, but for the purpose of this build, I'm just going to leave them all in the dependencies object here. So let's close this down now. And in my app.tsx, I now have the app here, but what I want to do is have a wrapper around the Apollo Client. So if I go into the browser for a moment and search for Apollo GraphQL, if we just click on Introduction to Apollo Client here and then Get Started. So now we have our start point of what we need to do, and essentially this is the instructions on how to set up the Apollo client on our project. So let's get started with that. So the first step and the second step we have now done, which is install the relevant packages. The next step is to initialize the Apollo client. So what I'm going to do is copy this code here, and I want to create an Apollo client file. So let's create that first of all. And in here, I already have my folder structure set up. So third-party packages go in the lib folder, and I've created a GraphQL folder, which has hooks, queries. But before I go into these folders, I want to create a new file in here called apolloclient.ts. So this is the client that we are going to be making for our higher order component. If I paste in what it says in the documentation, I now have the imports here. What I now want to do is go back into the documentation, and I can just simply copy the second part, which is creating a client like so. So let's create that as well. So now all I'm going to do is rename this to Apollo client in camel case like so, and then I just need to export default of Apollo client. This URL is not the correct URL that we need, so let's go back onto our Star Wars API, which is the one we need, and here we have the endpoint here, so we can just copy this and paste it into our code where it says the URI. What you could also do is put this in the env file and then keep it separate, and then just use process.env. whatever you name the endpoint for this. I'm just going to keep it as it is now. The Apollo provider and the GQL I'm just going to leave, so we're going to delete this one. So now if I save this, I now have created my client. And if I go back into my index.tsx, I now need to wrap this, but let's go back into the documentation to see the next steps. So if we scroll down, the first thing we need to do is create a query, but we're going to leave that for now. And this is the part what we need to do is connect the client to your React application. So essentially we're going to wrap it around our app like so. So let's go ahead and copy this. And then in our browser here, we're just going to paste this in. And to import Apollo provider, you just need to press Control Spacebar, and then it imports at the top here. And then the client we're going to use is the Apollo client that we have just created in our Apollo client.ts file. So let's go ahead and paste that in here, and then Control Space, and we also need to import this as well. So now if I save, that is that section complete. And just to double check the browser again, if we scroll down, the next step is to fetch the data that we need for this application. So let's go ahead and do that. So before we fetch the data, what GraphQL does, it provides you with a playground. So it says this is the data we will expect to receive when we do our successful fetch on our client side. So in home here, essentially what I have is the Explorer. So if we go into the API here, we have an Explorer here, so you can open it, and this is a playground for your GraphQL queries. So if I go into the Explorer here, for this build, there's quite a few things we can fetch data for, but the data I want to fetch is just the all films. So all we need to do is press the plus here. Essentially the query is the all films query, and inside here we have a few fields that we can pass. We can either select them on the left side using the plus, or in here we can just type control space, and then it brings down what we need as a list in here of what's available in the all films object. What I want is the films object, and then it brings down another drop down here of created, director, edited, and so on. So I want the ID, and I also want the director's name here. So on the right, if we click the blue button here, essentially what happens is it fetches the data. We have a status of 200 in here, and this is the response headers. So what I want to do is press this drop down here and get access to the response. So as you can see here, I have got access to all the films in Star Wars. The individual films is an array of objects that has the ID and the directors inside. And as you can see, most of them are George Lucas, but there's a few that have other directors in as well. So that's how you would make a query on the playground. So the next step is to create a query on the client on our React application, and then from there what we will do is fetch the data onto our application as well. So going back into our app here, I'm just going to close the client and the index because we are done with them now. In our lib folder where we have GraphQL here, we have a hooks folder and a queries folder. So in queries, I'm going to create a new file in here called index.ts, like so. And in here, this is the query we are going to be making. So essentially, if we just copy this and paste that in here, what we now need to do is create a constant. So this is going to be const get all films. So put this in capitals, is equal to GQL, which is what we need to import from Apollo client at the top here, which has backticks of the query we want. So all we need to do at the end of the query is close it off like so. And then that is query created. All I now need to do is export this query. So all you need to do is export get all films like so. So now this query is accessible across the application, and we have also decoupled it from the client. So now all I want to do is create a hook that can get accessed to our component or page that we create, and then that way we will be able to query this specific query here like so. What I also want to do is add a few more fields in here. So we want the title, director, release date, and producers. And if we just test to see if that works as well in the playground and press play, you can see here we have all of the data being fetched correctly and successfully here. So now that I have my query, I now need to create a hook, which is called use all films. And in use all films, I'm going to create a new file called index.tsx. And then this hook is going to be similar to a React functional component, so RAFCE. And then this is going to be called use all films, which doesn't take in an argument, so we can just leave that as is. But what we want is, we don't want to return a div. The first thing we want to do is destructure the data coming back from the use query, which is a hook from Apollo client. So if I just do const, and when we do a use query hook, essentially what happens is it returns back a few objects such as data, loading, and error. So if we tab and import that in, what I want to do is control spacebar to import use query from Apollo client, which essentially says use the query that I pass into this field here. So what I'm going to do is delete this for now. And the query I want to pass into here is the query we have made over here. So get all films. And I'm going to paste that in and control space to import it in as well. And then in my return block, instead of returning a div this time, I'm just going to return the data, loading, and error like so. So in our setup, we have a hooks folder, a queries folder, and a Apollo client. Apollo client is the client that wraps around the application, which is the higher order component of Apollo provider. We have queries where we can add multiple queries based on what you want from the playground, which is over here. And then the last one, which is the hooks, is essentially what we will use in our components to fetch the relevant data that we need and bring it to the client. And then that is returned as either successfully as data, loading state, or an error state. So there's no need for any sort of use states or use effects in this application.